while his pregnant wife cried at home. The Millionaire posted vacation. Pics with his mistress. Then came the audit. They say that beneath every polished photograph lies a truth we dare not expose. Meet Mark Rutherford, a millionaire who appeared to have it all, a sprawling empire, gleaming sports cars and high society connections from New York to Monaco. His social media profiles flaunted sun-kissed getaways with an alluring woman at his side, but the world didn't know the tears he left behind. At home, Mark's pregnant wife, Angela, anxiously awaited his return, watching in despair as he posted glamorous vacation photos with his secret mistress. Little did he realize that a brutal audit loomed on the horizon, poised to shatter his perfect facade. At first glance, the life of Mark Rutherford looked like a fairy tale. Hailing from a modest neighborhood in upstate New York, Mark had ascended the social and financial ladder at breathtaking speed. He had rebranded himself into a savvy businessman who moved effortlessly in circles filled with CEOs, philanthropists and venture capitalists from Manhattan. Guests at his lavish parties would whisper about Mark's meteoric rise, debating whether his success was the product of ruthless cunning, uncanny luck, or possibly both. His wife, Angela Rutherford, had grown up in an entirely different environment, sunlit farmland just outside Buffalo, A, kind and gentle soul. Angela had fallen for Mark's charm when they were young. In those early years, he possessed a rare combination of drive and tenderness. She could still recall the day he proposed an intimate picnic near a serene lake where he vowed to cherish her forever. Although the lake was hardly a glamorous setting, the genuine emotion in Mark's eyes made every breeze and sunbeam feel like divine blessings upon their union. Their first few years of marriage were marked by humble dreams and long conversations about building a stable future. Angela had a warm smile and an unyielding belief in Mark's potential. She supported him when he launched his first company, a small tech startup, funded by meager savings and the generosity of a few distant relatives. She listened patiently to his late-night brainstorming sessions and scribbled business plans on napkins. She believed wholeheartedly in the man who had once promised her that no matter how high he soared, he would never leave her side. But success, as it often does, transformed Mark. The better the company did, the more Mark's life became a whirlwind of red carpet galas, midnight phone calls with overseas clients, and secretive deals that always seemed to happen behind closed doors. Angela initially chalked it up to the demands of business. He was forging connections, building a network, ensuring they would never again fret about money. But as Mark's taste for luxury intensified, so did the gap between them. No longer content with a quiet dinner at home, he began to crave expensive restaurants, dinners with powerful executives, and weekends aboard yachts docked in exclusive marinas. During this swift transition from middle-class comfort to extravagant wealth, Angela sometimes felt like a relic of Mark's past. She struggled to navigate the new social circles he so eagerly embraced. It wasn't that Angela lacked sophistication, she simply had a different set of values. Surrounded by glitzy soirees and endless champagne flutes, Angela found herself quietly pining for their old lives, where a single bouquet of daisies and an evening stroll could ignite her spirit more than any five-star event. When Angela discovered she was pregnant, she hoped it might rekindle the warmth and closeness they once shared. She dreamed of Mark's strong arms wrapped around her, whispering excited plans for a nursery. Yet from the very first conversation, she sensed his excitement was tainted. Instead of wholeheartedly celebrating her news, he mumbled something about how a baby might complicate ongoing deals. She tried to reassure him that they would navigate parenthood just like any other challenge, united by love and commitment. But the more her belly grew, the more Mark seemed to drift. Business expansions, urgent calls from Hong Kong, clandestine texts that he refused to show her. These all took precedence. Angela, in the softness of her heart, convinced herself that Mark was merely stressed. He was under intense pressure, or so he said. If anything, it was a testament to how dedicated he was to providing a secure life for their future child. She held on to that thought like a lifeline, refusing to consider more troubling possibilities. Meanwhile, Mark privately relished his newfound status among the mega-rich. He had formed partnerships with influential names. One such person was Richard Caldwell, a private equity mogul known for his hush-hush real estate acquisitions from Manhattan to Los Angeles. Caldwell quickly became more than just a business contact. He was also Mark's mentor in the art of living lavishly, constantly reminding him, wealth is not just about what you own. It's about how you display it. Between the constant swirl of business negotiations and late-night private gatherings at Caldwell's penthouse, Mark found himself on a slippery slope of moral compromises. It wasn't just about ignoring Angela. He was now drawn to a lifestyle where excess blurred ethical lines, and where loyalty even to one spouse became just another disposable commodity. In the back of his mind, Mark rationalized everything. He was simply seizing opportunities that his younger self could only dream about. After all, once the dust settled, he'd settle down. He promised himself he would eventually focus on family life. Among the wave of new faces entering Mark's life was Cassie Delgado, a striking woman with flowing auburn hair who exuded confidence and ambition. She first appeared on the scene as a marketing consultant recommended by one of Mark's investors. Their initial meeting took place in a sleek Manhattan boardroom, and Cassie left a powerful impression. She had a knack for reading a room, understanding its power dynamics, and adjusting her tone to sway the conversation in her favor. Mark watched, half amazed and half envious, as she negotiated cutting-edge promotional deals with an ease and flair that rivaled his own. She was more than an adept negotiator. Her presence was magnetic. Cassie was the kind of woman who seemed to invite confessions and temptations, her laughter hinting at secrets waiting to be uncovered. When Mark discovered she came from a modest background much like his, he felt an immediate sense of kinship. She too had clawed her way up from near obscurity. They bonded over shared stories of once living paycheck to paycheck, mocking the condescending attitudes they endured from privileged elites. And yet, while Angela's gentle innocence had once captivated Mark, Cassie's fierceness both inspired and intimidated him. On the surface, they formed a natural professional alliance, two driven personalities with matching hunger for wealth and influence. Beneath that veneer, however, a different chemistry was building. Mutual admiration soon morphed into flirtatious texts, then secret coffee dates under the guise of client meetings. Cassie was shrewd enough to know exactly what she wanted. She was not a naive romantic easily carried away by Mark's charms. She calculated every advantage that could be gained from their liaison. Whenever Mark talked about his personal life, Cassie would gently place a hand on his shoulder, tilt her head with empathy, and convince him that she alone understood his pressures. At first, it was subtle comfort during stressful work situations. But as time wore on, those stolen moments felt like portals to an alternate reality, where Mark wasn't obligated to be the doting husband or expectant father. He was free to indulge in Cassie's wiles, free to forget that Angela existed at home, softly crying herself to sleep. Each clandestine meeting fueled an adrenaline rush, unlike anything Mark had felt before. One evening, Cassie invited him to a high-end fashion show after party, an event teeming with celebrities and socialites. Mark reasoned it was good for networking, so he attended in the dimly lit VIP lounge amid pulsing music and expensive champagne. Mark kissed Cassie for the first time. Angela was thousands of miles away in Buffalo for a prenatal checkup, but even if she had been in the same city, Mark doubted the outcome would have changed. Cassie was intoxicating. For a while, their affair was their best-kept secret. Mark rationalized that no real harm was done. He was merely satisfying a physical and emotional itch. Business thrived, and Mark promised himself that once the baby arrived, he would end it. He pictured a scenario in which he'd gracefully cut ties with Cassie, quietly return to Angela, and no one would ever know. But the more he tried to imagine an exit strategy, the deeper he sank into Cassie's enticements. Before long, Cassie began to sense Mark's warring guilt. She was nobody's fool. She noticed the anxious tone in his voice after each rendezvous and spotted the wedding ring he rarely took off. Yet she never pushed for a more official status. She didn't need to. Her hold over him was strong enough, and she reaped benefits as his preferred consultant, winning her lucrative contracts. Unbeknownst to Mark, Cassie also had connections in other circles. She heard whispers of the IRS investigating not just Mark's businesses, but also Caldwell's. These tidbits floated around black-tie galas and hush-hush dinners. She gleaned from passing remarks how Mark's deals sometimes skirted the edges of legality. It was all speculation, but she kept it stored in the back of her mind should she ever need an ace up her sleeve. Angela, meanwhile, was growing more anxious by the day. Mark's excuses for his long absences piled up crucial deals, hectic travel schedules, emergency client meetings at odd hours. At times, Angela tried to voice her concerns, but Mark always brushed them off with dismissive gestures, telling her not to stress herself out during the pregnancy. Each time she felt a nagging sense that something was deeply amiss, but she forced herself to believe Mark's explanations. After all, how could the father of her unborn child be unfaithful? He was the man who once sobbed tears of joy when she agreed to marry him. Yet on nights when the loneliness grew unbearable, Angela couldn't help scrolling through Mark's social media, analyzing every new post or tagged photo like a detective on the verge of an explosive revelation. She couldn't place it exactly, but she sensed that the radiant smile on Mark's face in those pictures wasn't the same one he reserved for her or once had. Something vital had changed. It was as if he had found a new source of excitement, leaving Angela feeling more invisible with each passing day. Angela had no idea that an even bigger betrayal was about to blow their world apart, that her husband's business partner was really a mistress, and neither Mark nor Cassie suspected that the glittering tapestry of their covert romance was about to be torn asunder by forces far beyond their control. After all, if there's one thing life teaches us, it's that no secret can stay hidden forever, and that a reckoning is inevitable when you've built your castle on shifting sand. At home, each day of Angela's pregnancy crawled by like a slow-moving storm cloud. She had hoped that her growing belly would be a beacon of joy for both her and Mark, proof that love could endure beyond the manic hustle of corporate life. Instead, she found herself more alone than ever. Friends suggested prenatal yoga, childbirth classes, or baby shower plans, but Angela found it hard to join in the celebrations. How could she rejoice when Mark seemed only half present? Angela's symptoms, morning sickness, mood swings, and constant fatigue, were magnified by emotional distress. Nights brought panic attacks that left her trembling under the covers, her tears dampening the pillow. Where was the partner who had once held her tight, reminding her that everything would be okay. Where was the man who had promised to love her in sickness and in health? When she tried to reach out, the phone calls went unanswered or were hurriedly cut short. Mark's texts, once affectionate, devolved into bullet points of half-hearted excuses. He reassured her, big project in Hong Kong, investors in town, busy with conference calls, will be home soon. Angela yearned to believe these promises. But as the weeks went on, she could sense the widening gap. She sought solace in memories of happier times, the first months of their marriage, in a small but cozy apartment, the simple act of cooking dinner together, laughing at inside jokes no one else could understand. Now the mansion they called home felt like an empty museum, its gilded ornaments and plush furniture mocking her loneliness. The house staff, housekeeper, chef, and driver tried to care for Angela, but their presence only highlighted Mark's absence. One evening, determined to bring back a shred of normalcy, Angela arranged a special dinner complete with soft candlelight and her favorite homemade lasagna. She spent hours meticulously preparing each ingredient, all in hopes that Mark would come home and remember the love they once shared. She waited, her heart pounding at each passing minute. Midnight came and went, and by 1 a.m, the lasagna was cold and her tears were hot on her cheeks. Mark never walked through the door. Days blurred together in a monotonous cycle of doctor's visits and heartbreak. Angela's obstetrician, Dr. Viola Bancroft, gently advised her to minimize stress, emphasizing how harmful chronic anxiety could be for both mother and baby. Angela tried. She practiced deep breathing exercises, wrote in a journal, and consulted with a pregnancy counselor. In private moments, she'd place her hand on her belly, speaking softly to the life growing within her. She promised her unborn child that no matter what, they would be loved. Even if Mark never returned to them in the way he once was, Angela resolved to be strong. But that resolve wavered whenever Angela spotted something suspicious online. Mark's social media, once a tame collection of business achievements and philanthropic engagements, had transformed into a gallery of exotic beaches, poolside cocktails, and glamorous parties. And he wasn't alone in these photos. A beautiful red-haired woman, sometimes tagged as Cassie Delgado, appeared in the background, or sometimes right by Mark's side. The two looked far too comfortable, far too close. Angela tried to reason with herself that maybe it was innocent, a professional associate or a friend. Yet the intimacy in their smiles felt like a dagger in Angela's heart. She dared not question Mark about it directly. She feared the answers she might get, or worse, the way he might dismiss her concerns altogether. Still, the seed of suspicion grew fueled by late-night social media stalking and the silent agony of her intuition. Each time Angela tried to bring up Cassie's name, Mark would brush it off, repeating lines like, "She's a valuable consultant," or "We're finalizing a huge deal, stop worrying." Angela's internal turmoil escalated until one night she broke down completely. She found herself curled up on the floor of the master bedroom, phone clutched in her shaking hand, sobbing uncontrollably. The images of Mark's apparent happiness with this other woman tormented her. Her growing stomach only served as a painful reminder that while her body prepared for motherhood, Mark seemed to be living a carefree, childless existence. Amid her tears, Angela realized something she was witnessing. Mark's transformation into the kind of man he once despised, someone who put material success and fleeting pleasures above everything else, including loyalty and love. The questions piled up. Could she trust him anymore? Would he even want to be part of the baby's life? And what if these business trips were mere covers for wild vacations with Cassie? Quietly, Angela decided that if Mark refused to come home to her, she would seek the truth on her own terms. She began to imagine confronting him directly, to see his reaction, to see if he'd lie to her face. For Angela, the days of silent suffering might soon come to an end. But before she could fully plan her confrontation, fate began its own countdown. Forces were converging behind the scenes, angry investors, suspicious auditors, and the unstoppable momentum of gossip that swirled through the social circles Mark desperately tried to impress, unaware of the storm that lay ahead. Angela continued to cling to one fragile hope that Mark would redeem himself before it was too late. Beachfront villas, crystal blue waters, and indulgent spa treatments at world-class resorts. This was Mark's new normal whenever he traveled with Cassie. The pair found endless excuses to combine work trips with scenic getaways, posting tastefully curated snapshots on social media. In each photo, Mark radiated a carefree smile, as if the sum of his worries amounted to nothing more significant than choosing the next cocktail to sip. Cassie orchestrated every shot, understanding the power of optics. She took great care to capture Mark against a backdrop of towering palm trees, their fronds swaying above him like a king's canopy. In some photos, Cassie stood at the edge of the frame, an enigmatic figure sipping champagne. The images ignited social media buzz and gossip in their swanky circles. Who is that stunning redhead with Mark Rutherford? Is she his new business partner or something more? The speculation only added to the thrilling aura of their forbidden escapade. For Mark, the vacation pics served a dual purpose. First, they fed his ego. After years of hustling to get recognized by society's upper echelons, he relished every like, comment, and message praising his amazing life. Second, they were a form of self-deception. If he convinced the world he was happy, maybe he could stifle the nagging guilt in his conscience. Guilt about leaving Angela alone at home, pregnant and distraught. Of course, Mark conveniently never mentioned Angela in these posts, nor did he reveal the existence of an unborn child. He rationalized that it was a private matter, not suited for public consumption. When friends and acquaintances inquired about Angela, he'd respond with vague statements. Oh, she's busy preparing for the baby, or traveling isn't safe for her right now. He avoided deeper questions at all costs. The last thing he wanted was an unscripted interview on how his personal life was unraveling. Cassie, meanwhile, reveled in her rising social profile. She found herself tagged in photos by influencers and minor celebrities who recognized Mark's wealth and Cassie's clever marketing strategies. Doors to exclusive events opened, wider brunch invitations from industry heavyweights rolled in. Through all this, Cassie remained calculated. She encouraged Mark to spend more lavishly to cultivate a public image as a worldly magnate on the verge of major global deals. That meant private jets instead of first-class commercial flights, dinners at Michelin-starred restaurants, and suites in the most luxurious hotels. Mark complied, though each charge made his accountants and financial managers increasingly anxious. None of this extravagance occurred without cost. Mark's fluid capital was tied up in high-risk ventures. Liquidity was tighter than appearances suggested. He juggled lines of credit and questionable transactions, leaning heavily on Caldwell's counsel. Caldwell, too, urged Mark to keep the momentum of success going. Fake it till you make it was essentially their unspoken mantra. As long as public perception remained, stellar deals would keep flowing, and the heavy interest rates and balloon payments could be pushed further into the future. But cracks in the glossy surface began to form. On a particular getaway in Fiji, Mark received a barrage of frantic texts from his CFO. Financial regulators were poking around. Some suspicious wire transfers were flagged. Panicked investors were demanding clarifications on how Mark's so-called expansions aligned with his sudden personal spending, Mark tried to brush it off, determined not to let anything ruin his beach holiday with Cassie. He reasoned that this was just a minor hiccup. Nothing a few well-placed phone calls and quick financial maneuvers couldn't fix. Cassie, ever attuned to the slightest shift in Mark's mood, pressed him for details. He only offered vague reassurances about routine audits and overzealous inspectors. This was the first time she witnessed a real worry flicker behind Mark's confident facade. Sensing the potential threat to her cushy arrangement, Cassie tried to downplay it, coaxing him back into the carefree zone. They snapped more radiant selfies on the shore, hoping to drown out reality with digital illusions. Unbeknownst to them, Angela was scrolling through these very pictures. At that moment, tears streaming down her cheeks as she recognized the hotel's name from a travel magazine. The woman in Mark's arms wasn't just a business partner. No professional consultant gazed at a client with such intimate adoration. Angela felt a sharp ache in her chest as she realized how little Mark cared about hiding his betrayal. The audacity of his posts was almost surreal. Desperation clawed at Angela's insides. Perhaps confronting him through a phone call where she could hear his voice break if he lied was her best shot at forcing the truth. Gathering her nerve, she dialed Mark's number. No answer. She tried again and again, only to be met with voicemail. Anger flared up in her, a rage she'd never felt before. This was no longer a series of unfortunate misunderstandings or too busy at work moments. This was blatant humiliation. In the background, the swirl of an IRS investigation was growing stronger. Anonymous tips and suspicious transaction reports had caught the attention of forensic accountants who were beginning to follow the money trail. The timing of Mark's lavish travels raised red flags. Why, they wondered, would a businessman under such financial scrutiny broadcast opulent holidays across social media? Didn't he realize that auditors often examine lifestyle displays as part of their case? For Mark, ignorance felt like bliss. The more pictures he posted, the less real his looming problems seemed. Yet reality was closing in fast. The golden sand and azure waves might have served as a temporary stage for his fabricated paradise, but the tides were about to shift. And when they did, they'd wash away more than just footprints in the sand. While Mark and Cassie soaked in, the Fiji Sun agents at the Internal Revenue Service's Manhattan branch started piecing together fragments of an intricate puzzle. Spearheading the investigation was a meticulous auditor named Mallory Finch, reputed for her tenacity and keen ability to spot inconsistencies in vast financial records. Mallory had received a discreet tip about Mark Rutherford's questionable income streams, and once she opened his file, she discovered an alarming mismatch between his reported earnings and the lifestyle he flaunted. Mallory was never one to jump to conclusions, but the more she dug, the more anomalies she found. A sudden influx of capital, suspiciously timed with Mark's social media updates of private jet getaways, a pattern of shell companies popping up in multiple states, then vanishing without clear financial statements, offshore accounts vaguely tied to Mark's business, some of which contained substantial deposits from individuals flagged for previous tax evasion. These pieces raised her eyebrows, and Mallory suspected this investigation could balloon into something far larger than a mere tax discrepancy. Her next step involved contacting individuals who might share insights on Mark's dealings. One name that kept surfacing was Richard Caldwell, the private equity mogul rumored to have a hand in Mark's expansions. Caldwell himself was already under IRS scrutiny for unrelated properties in Florida and the Carolinas. If Caldwell and Mark were pooling resources in some illicit scheme, it could spell big headlines. Mallory prepared requests for bank statements, wire transfers, credit card expenditures, anything that would illustrate the true scope of Mark's financial empire. At the same time, Mark's CFO, Brian Cummings, was drowning in chaos. As soon as he noticed the heightened interest from regulatory authorities, Brian tried to warn Mark. But each call went unanswered, each email unreturned. Panic thrummed in Brian's chest. The entire finance department was on edge, especially after receiving official requests from the IRS for detailed financial records. Paper trails that Mark had insisted be handled discreetly were now fair game. If Mark didn't address these issues promptly, the meltdown would be inevitable. Behind the scenes, Caldwell played it cool. In public, he would toast Mark as a brilliant entrepreneur and encourage him to keep up appearances. In private, Caldwell had already started distancing himself, transferring assets and instructing his own legal team to prepare for inquiries. If the walls caved in, Caldwell intended to emerge with minimal damage, leaving Mark to shoulder the brunt of the consequences. Word of the looming audit spread quietly through Manhattan's financial circles. Bankers and lawyers connected to Mark had hushed luncheons, speculating about the magnitude of his troubles. Some predicted he'd face a heavy fine at best, or a full-scale criminal investigation. At worst, a few even took delight in the prospect of Mark's downfall, viewing it as an inevitable collapse for a man who rose too fast, spent too freely, and believed himself untouchable. Meanwhile, Angela was oblivious to the complexities of Mark's finances. Her world was confined to heartbreak and concern over her unborn child. She knew Mark must be in trouble. The abrupt changes in his behavior, the money he threw around so casually, the hush-hush deals he once mentioned but refused to elaborate upon. Yet she couldn't fathom the depth of the scandal brewing. Each day her anxiety deepened, a feeling that something catastrophic was hovering just out of sight. It all came to a head when Angela received a strange phone call from one of Mark's junior associates, a woman named Kara Hoffman. Although Kara didn't divulge specifics, she sounded panicked. "Angela, I don't know if you're aware, but there are investigations going on. Things look bad." Angela's heart pounded in her ears as Kara's words spilled over the line. "We're being asked for documents, receipts. I think Mark's in serious trouble. And look, this might not be my place, but I think you should know Mark's not who he used to be." Angela thanked Kara, her mind spiraling with questions. What exactly were they investigating? Had Mark committed fraud? Was he actually bankrupt and hiding the truth? The uncertainties gnawed at her. She ended the call feeling more determined than ever to confront Mark. She realized that her heartbreak over his possible affair was only one part of a bigger, uglier picture. If he was entangled in financial crimes, her unborn child's future would be at stake too. In Fiji, Mark was irritated to see a slew of missed calls from Brian and a cryptic text from Caldwell. "We need to talk ASAP." He tried to keep his calm exterior, but Cassie noticed the worry lines etched across his brow. Over an expensive bottle of wine at a cliffside restaurant, Mark finally admitted to her that the IRS might be launching a routine audit, but insisted it was nothing major. Cassie, who had heard different rumors from her insider network, suspected it was more serious than Mark let on. Yet she feigned reassurance, drawing Mark into a languid embrace. They'd handle it together, she cooed. They were unstoppable when united. That night, however, Cassie stepped outside onto the moonlit beach and placed a phone call to one of her closest confidants, an attorney who specialized in corporate law. Just in case she wanted to know her rights and potential liabilities, if Mark went down, Cassie had no intention of going down with him. Far away from that tranquil beach, Mallory Finch and her team worked late hours, scanning through reams of documents. Something big was surfacing, a web of shell companies, unaccounted funds, and potential tax evasion, so blatant it nearly dared the authorities to react. As she compiled her findings, Mallory sensed a storm about to erupt. The wealthy always believed they could outrun the law, but in her experience, hubris was their undoing. She gave a final glance at Mark's social media feed, scoffing at the gall of a man who flaunted paradise while standing at the brink of a scandal. Angela stood at the top of the grand staircase, the late afternoon sun illuminating her pregnant silhouette as she awaited Mark's return. She had summoned every last shred of courage to do what she should have done weeks ago, demand answers face to face. The house staff, sensing the tension, made themselves scarce. Rarely did Angela request the entire household's presence be minimal, but now she needed privacy. She needed space to unleash her anguish without an audience. Finally, Mark entered, dragging a suitcase behind him. He looked exhausted, yet still wore that forced confidence he had perfected in boardrooms. Angela's throat constricted at the sight of him. This was the man she'd once adored, now nearly a stranger. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger and hurt. Mark's immediate instinct was to deflect Angela. "I've just come off a long flight. Can we do this later?" He began massaging his temples dramatically, but Angela stood firm, crossing her arms protectively over her belly. "No, now." A tense silence fell between them in the marble-floored foyer. Angela had rehearsed this confrontation dozens of times in her head, but the actual moment felt surreal. She started with the obvious, his social media posts. She demanded to know who the woman was, whether Cassie Delgado was truly just a consultant. Mark tried to dismiss it as exaggerated rumors describing Cassie as a business partner who happened to be a close friend. Yet Angela's tears and fury dissolved any illusions. She raged at him for abandoning her during the pregnancy, for flaunting a lavish lifestyle, while she dealt with swollen ankles, hormonal surges, and sleepless nights alone. Her voice rose with each accusation. She brandished printouts of Mark's social media pictures, her hands shaking violently. "You think I'm stupid? Look at how she stares at you in these pictures." Her tears glimmered in the light, but her voice stayed sharp, revealing a hidden steeliness that Mark was unprepared for. Cornered Mark tried to justify himself. He mumbled about stressful deals and complicated emotions, as though that gave him a license to betray her. Sometimes I feel trapped. Our life, it got so big, so fast. I never wanted to hurt you." But Angela's eyes, filled with betrayal, told him that any excuse would be hollow. Then came the topic Mark dreaded most: the IRS investigation. Angela slammed a folder onto a nearby coffee table containing the messages and notices she had intercepted from Mark's CFO and legal team. "I'm not a fool, Mark. What's going on with our finances? Are we in danger?" Her voice cracked, revealing not just anger, but a profound fear for the baby's future. Mark went pale. Faced with no way out, Mark finally admitted pieces of the truth: that the IRS was scrutinizing his accounts and that Caldwell was under investigation. He glossed over the details, claiming it was merely a routine check, but Angela knew better. She told him about the phone call from Kara Hoffman, the anxiety in the finance department, the hush-hush rumors swirling in business circles. Mark's casual dismissal of the audit set her on edge. She could see the worry etched in his eyes, belying his false assurances. In that painful moment, Angela realized they were standing on the precipice of something far larger than infidelity. They were at risk of losing their home, their reputations, possibly even their freedom if Mark's dealings were truly illegal. A swirl of confusion overtook her. How could the man she loved, who once saved every penny to buy her a modest engagement ring, have drifted so far into moral bankruptcy, summoning what strength she had, left Angela delivered an ultimatum. Either you end this affair, cooperate fully with the investigation, and prove you can be a father, or I'll leave. I won't stand by and let you drag me and our child down with you. Her tone was firm, a quiet declaration that shattered Mark's self-serving illusions. For the first time, he saw in Angela a strength more formidable than he had ever imagined. He stuttered, pleading with her to let him make it. Right, insisting that Cassie meant nothing, that he'd handle the IRS. But Angela stared at him, tears still streaming. She gave him one last chance, an opportunity to come clean and choose family over his addictive chase for wealth and excitement. Mark stood there, drenched in shame and uncertainty, uncertain if he could muster the courage to confront the monstrous problems he himself had created. The moment Mark set foot in his corner office. The next day, he felt the tension in the air so thick it could be cut with a knife. Several of his junior associates were huddled in the hallway, whispering among themselves. His CFO, Brian Cummings, appeared frazzled eyes, lined with dark circles from working through the night. A handful of boxes, filled with financial documents, stood stacked against the walls, evidence that the office had been combed through thoroughly. No sooner had Mark taken a seat behind his expansive mahogany desk than Mallory Finch, the lead auditor from the IRS, entered the room. She introduced herself politely, but her demeanor carried the authority of someone who had already unearthed serious irregularities. Mark tried to maintain his usual cool composure, but Mallory's questions were pointed. We'll need full access to your ledgers, bank statements, and any documentation related to your offshore accounts, she stated, her voice calm yet unyielding. One by one, Mark's staff delivered files to Mallory and her audit team. The entire office felt like a crime scene, with accountants and lawyers picking through every line item, every receipt and every contract. Mark attempted to project an air of cooperation, hoping that by acting transparent, he might reduce suspicion. Yet behind the facade, panic flared in his chest with each document he signed over. Over the following days, Mallory's team uncovered evidence of large sums of money flowing through shell corporations. Whenever Mark tried to feign ignorance, Mallory presented him with email correspondences or suspicious wire transfer confirmations bearing his digital signature. In meeting after meeting, Mark struggled to explain the labyrinthine structure of his business dealings. He found himself stumbling over the complexities, some of which Caldwell had orchestrated. Meanwhile, Caldwell was conspicuously absent. Phone calls to him went straight to voicemail, and cryptic text messages offered no real support. Mark finally reached Caldwell's lawyer, only to be informed that Caldwell was unavailable and that Mark should speak to his own legal counsel. Though Mark's official stance remained that he and Caldwell were partners, Caldwell had begun insulating himself from the fallout. Cassie, too, seemed suddenly distant. She had been helpful before, but once the audit gained momentum, she avoided dropping by the office or appearing with Mark publicly. She insisted it was best to keep a low profile until the situation blew over. Privately, Cassie was assessing whether Mark was worth sticking around for, or if she should jump ship to protect her burgeoning career. The glow of their sun-drenched vacations felt like a lifetime ago. Now every conversation crackled with tension. Amid the chaos, Angela received a flurry of calls from Mark's lawyers, advising her to limit any public statements or social media posts that might affect the ongoing investigation. Though she had no intention of speaking publicly, she understood the subtext. They feared she might vent her frustrations, potentially exposing more of Mark's secrets. She responded politely, but remained on guard, reluctant to trust anyone paid by Mark's questionable fortunes. But for Angela, the real challenge was emotional. She felt paralyzed, uncertain whether to believe Mark's repeated assertions that he was handling it. With each day, her baby grew inside her, a silent testament to the gravity of the life choices swirling around her. She was torn between anger, heartbreak, and the faint hope that Mark could somehow rectify the damage he'd wrought. As the audit wore on, Mark's worst fears materialized. His personal finances, those he had guarded most fiercely, were now under scrutiny. Mallory's team discovered that some of his lavish personal expenses were siphoned directly from corporate accounts. Worse, there was evidence of tax fraud, with Mark claiming deductions for luxury trips that in reality had nothing to do with legitimate business. It was the perfect storm for a case that could escalate beyond simple fines into criminal charges. In a tense meeting late one evening, Mark's legal counsel laid everything on the table. If you don't fully cooperate and provide any remaining documents, the IRS may pursue charges. You could face prison time, Mark reeled. Jail had never been part of his wildest calculations. He had assumed that being wealthy and well-connected would insulate him from serious legal consequences. Now that protective veil was disintegrating, needing a lifeline. Mark attempted to reach out to Caldwell one last time. To his shock, Caldwell's phone was answered by a cold, automated voice announcing the number had been disconnected. A follow-up call to Caldwell's office revealed that the mogul was allegedly overseas for an extended period. Mark cursed under his breath, realizing he had been left to fend for himself in a lion's den. The man who had once toasted to their partnership was now vanishing like smoke. That night, Mark sat alone in his office, the city lights glimmering through floor-to-ceiling windows, reflecting off the scattered paperwork that spelled doom for his financial empire. He considered calling Cassie to vent or beg for comfort, but the prospect of another hollow reassurance made his stomach churn. As he stared at the final remnants of his once grandiose aspirations, a pang of regret rattled him. He had traded his wife's love and his family's future for fleeting thrills and illusions of grandeur. Now the audit threatened to expose every lie he'd told to Angela, to the world, and most damningly to himself. In the days that followed, the audit expanded, touching not only Mark's direct holdings, but also affiliated partnerships. News leaked, leading to sensational headlines. Millionaire entrepreneur under IRS probe, high-flying lifestyle meets harsh reality, and partner of Richard Caldwell, questioned in major tax evasion case. Journalists began digging into Mark's background, painting him as the poster child for new money gone awry. Every flashy social media post he'd made with Cassie became tabloid fodder. The images relabeled as evidence of possible embezzlement. His office phone rang incessantly with calls from investors, business associates, and even distant relatives who wanted their slice of the truth or an explanation of how he'd tarnished the family name. Mark's PR team scrambled to contain the fallout, spinning statements about how he was fully cooperating with authorities. But the tone was grim, and the public consensus leaned toward condemnation. People love a success story, but they find an equal or perhaps greater thrill in watching a figure stumble, especially one who had reveled in ostentatious displays of wealth. Cassie Delgado, once an ever-present source of excitement, showed up unannounced at Mark's office one evening. Her eyes darted nervously around the reception area, where agents and lawyers were busily poring over boxes of files. She slipped into Mark's private suite, shutting the door behind her with a soft click. Mark, physically and emotionally drained, looked up surprised and guarded. She spoke in a hushed tone, a tremor in her voice, betraying the panic beneath her practiced composure. "Mark, this is getting out of hand. The IRS could start looking into every transaction I handled for you. My name is on some of those marketing contracts. If they think I'm part of this..." She left the threat unspoken. Mark stared at her, half annoyed, half sympathetic. He realized she had never planned to be caught in a legal quagmire. Her loyalty was as transactional as any of his offshore ventures. In a bid to reassure her, Mark promised that her name would remain clear, insisting she hadn't knowingly committed any crimes. She demanded to see documents, emails, receipts, anything to confirm she wouldn't be implicated. Reluctantly, Mark allowed her a glimpse into some sanitized versions of his accounts. Yet the tension between them was palpable. The illusions of a carefree relationship disintegrated under the weight of potential indictments. Cassie left the office with no promise of a future rendezvous. Meanwhile, Angela found herself navigating a different battleground. Mark's lawyers pressed her to sign documents that would shield certain assets under her name, presumably to separate them from Mark's precarious financial entanglements. Confused and wary, Angela enlisted a lawyer of her own. She wasn't about to let Mark's shady dealings ruin her credit or her standing, especially with a baby on the way. Protect yourself, her lawyer advised. You don't want to be tied to anything that could be seized if this goes south. At night, Angela wrestled with a storm of emotions. She was furious with Mark for placing her in such a precarious position, but also worried about the father of her child, potentially facing prison. Her moral dilemma festered. Should she stand by him in hopes that he'd transform back into the man she once loved, or should she cut ties, safeguarding herself and her baby from the inevitable destruction? Amid this maelstrom, Mark's friend-turned-mentor, Richard Caldwell, maintained an enigmatic distance. Whispers circulated that Caldwell had fled to a non-extradition country, or was in the process of shifting assets to offshore havens. A single short letter from Caldwell's legal team arrived at Mark's office, disclaiming any responsibility for Mark's financial decisions. It stated, Caldwell was prepared to cooperate with authorities if he was subpoenaed. Mark felt a chill at the underlying threat Caldwell might cut a deal that implicated him in exchange for leniency. In desperation, Mark tried to salvage at least one partnership. He invited one of his key investors, Michael Evans, a man he once considered a friend, to dinner at an upscale restaurant. The objective was to reassure Evans that the business still had potential, that Mark's personal troubles wouldn't sink their joint ventures. But over the flicker of candlelight, Evans drummed his fingers on the table and coldly remarked, I invested in your vision. Mark, not in your vanity. Now it seems all you cared about was flaunting money you didn't even have. The meal ended early with Evans walking away, refusing to share even a parting handshake. Humiliation sank heavily into Mark's gut. Doors that once opened for him, private clubs, elite investment groups were swiftly closing. Rumors and half-truths spread. People who had lauded him for his risk-taking brilliance now labeled him reckless or even criminally negligent. Each day felt like a war of attrition on his spirit, culminating in the knowledge that he had orchestrated his own downfall. In a final desperate effort, Mark turned to Angela, swallowing his pride. He arrived at the mansion late one evening, drenched by a sudden rainstorm, and found her in the living room, reading pregnancy guides by the flickering fire. Collapsing to his knees beside her, Mark pleaded for her forgiveness, promising to set everything right. He vowed to cut ties with Cassie and even threatened legal action against Caldwell, swearing he would devote himself to her and their unborn child if she would just stand by him through the audit. Angela listened with weary eyes. She wanted to believe him, yearned for the possibility of redemption. But trust is not an infinite resource. However profound her love might have been, it was battered and fragile now. Mark, she whispered, voice trembling. I need more than promises. I need a reason to believe you'll truly change for once. Mark had no clever comeback, no glib assurance. He simply held Angela's hands in his own, the silent tears mixing with the rainwater dripping from his hair. Yet in her mind, Angela couldn't shake the image of him, carefree on some exotic beach, while her tears stained the floors of an empty home. Whether he was truly remorseful or just desperate to avoid utter collapse, she couldn't quite discern. The inevitable moment came one crisp autumn morning. Mark received a summons detailing the IRS's intent to pursue charges of tax fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to evade taxes. Although formal indictments had not yet been filed, the document spelled out enough to shake Mark to his core. If convicted, he could face hefty fines and potentially years behind bars. News outlets pounced on the story, fueling public outrage over Mark's ostentatious lifestyle at the expense of unpaid taxes and possible illegal gains. Overnight, he became a pariah. The viral hashtag #RutherfordCoreReckoning trended across social media, accompanied by pictures from his once vaunted Instagram feed. Memes ridiculed him as a cautionary tale of greed and moral decay. As the IRS case progressed, Mark's lawyers advised him to seek a plea deal, something that might reduce jail time if he cooperated fully and revealed any co-conspirators. Mark balked at first. The mere idea of turning on Caldwell felt like a betrayal. But Caldwell had already disappeared from Mark's life, leaving a trail of plausible deniability. There was no loyalty to preserve anymore. In a tense meeting with his legal team, Mark agreed to provide detailed accounts of his transactions with Caldwell and the shady practices they had employed to mask income. It was a desperate act, akin to dragging others into the fire to lessen his own burns. Mark felt equal parts anger and shame. His once proud confidence had eroded, leaving behind a man grasping for any lifeline. Meanwhile, Angela watched from the sidelines, sickened and heartbroken. She was summoned as well, though primarily as a witness. Her name was on certain joint bank accounts. Her baby bump had grown. Each kick reminded her of the new life she was trying to protect. She prepared herself to testify, truthfully determined not to lie for Mark. If he had ever truly loved her, he wouldn't force her into the role of accomplice. Cassie Delgado, too, was called for questioning. While her official work for Mark's firm was deemed legitimate, investigators wanted to ensure she wasn't complicit in any financial crimes. Terrified of criminal charges, Cassie painted herself as merely an employee, someone who had no role in Mark's financial decisions. She cooperated, answering every question about Mark's whereabouts, his corporate spending, and how business expenses often appeared suspiciously personal in nature. With her personal involvement clarified, Cassie walked away unscathed, albeit her reputation irreparably tarnished. The final blow to Mark's empire came with a court-ordered freeze on many of his assets. His mansion went into foreclosure, luxury cars were repossessed, and his bank accounts were seized, pending further legal proceedings. One by one, employees in his companies were laid off, fueling bitter resentment from families who relied on those paychecks. Mark couldn't meet payroll or vendor obligations. He watched helplessly as everything he'd built, the offices, the brand, the illusions, crumbled. Angela made the difficult decision to move out of the mansion before the bank officially reclaimed it. She refused Mark's tearful requests to stay by his side, insisting they needed space to reflect. She settled temporarily in a modest apartment near her parents, choosing to focus on her well-being and the baby's imminent arrival. Her lawyer had successfully shielded her personal finances, ensuring she wouldn't be dragged into Mark's legal vortex. On the day Mark finally accepted the plea agreement, reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, cameras flashed. As he walked in, his hair unkempt, dark circles under his eyes. The same man who once strutted in designer suits now wore a resigned expression and an off-the-rack outfit. In front of a judge, he spoke words he never envisioned uttering. "I plead guilty, Your Honor." The plea involved cooperating with ongoing investigations into Caldwell's network, offering testimony regarding their underhanded financial schemes. Though prison time was nearly certain, it might be lessened due to his cooperation. Standing in that courtroom, Mark felt a nauseating swirl of regret. He flashed back to simpler times, when a faithful wife, a small apartment, and a dream for a better life had been enough. How far he had strayed. Walking out to a chorus of shouted questions from journalists, Mark said nothing. His lawyer shielded him, guiding him into a waiting car. As they pulled away, he glimpsed a billboard on a nearby building. It displayed a gleaming tropical scene, with a couple laughing on a beach, a seductive advertisement for holiday packages. He closed his eyes, remembering his social media posts with Cassie under exactly such a sun. The irony was as bitter as the metallic taste of fear and regret on his tongue. In the ensuing weeks, Mark prepared for sentencing. The judge would weigh his cooperation against the severity of his crimes. He resided in a small, barren apartment, a far cry from his former luxury. The silence at night was deafening, and sleep evaded him. He alternated between making calls to his remaining legal counsel and drafting letters of apology to employees, to business partners, and most painfully to Angela. While Mark grappled with his new reality, Angela focused on hers. She continued prenatal checkups, often accompanied by her supportive mother. Away from the oppressive gloom of Mark's downfall, Angela found moments of calm, even happiness. She set up a simple nursery in her parents' home, painting the walls a gentle shade of yellow. As she folded tiny baby clothes, she felt a blend of apprehension and resolve. The future was uncertain, but she would not let Mark's mistakes define her child's life. As Mark approached his sentencing date, he met again with Mallory Finch, the steadfast IRS auditor who had spearheaded the case. Despite her unwavering professionalism, Mallory sensed the tragic undertones of Mark's journey. She had encountered dozens of wealthy individuals who believed themselves untouchable, but Mark's downfall seemed particularly steep. When Mark thanked her, an odd moment of gratitude to the person who had effectively unraveled his life, Mallory simply responded, "I hope this leads you to a better path." On a chilly winter afternoon, Angela went into labor, surrounded by her mother, her sister, and a compassionate medical staff. She brought a healthy baby boy into the world. She named him Daniel, honoring her grandfather. As she held her son for the first time, tears rolled down her cheeks. This was a new beginning, fragile, beautiful, and untainted by the sins of the father. Mark, informed by letter, received the news in his prison cell. He felt a pang of both joy and sorrow, imagining the life he could have shared with them, if only he hadn't succumbed to greed and self-indulgence. Restricted by concrete walls and razor wire, he could only dream of a day he might hold his child. He resolved that if he ever got the chance, he would be a better man. This real-life drama story of grandiose wealth, crushing betrayal, and hard-earned redemption reminds us that no amount of luxury can outweigh the value of loyalty and honesty. Mark Rutherford's rise and fall echo a stark warning beneath every glittering facade. Lie choices that can shatter families and futures if we allow greed to eclipse our moral compass. Angela's journey underlines the power of inner strength. By choosing integrity over complicity, she protected not just herself, but the next generation. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this gripping saga. If you found value or inspiration in Angela's resilience and learned from Mark's tragic lessons, please take a moment to like this video, share it with others who need a wake-up call, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we continue to explore life's most dramatic stories. reminding ourselves of the profound consequences of our actions and the resilience of the human spirit.
Millionaire sees his ex-wife with their son at a luxury store, but he's shocked to find out. What if the price of success was everything you ever cared about? What if the very thing you thought would bring you happiness ended up tearing apart the most important parts of your life? This is the story of a man who spent years climbing the ladder of success, only to realize that the higher he went, the further he drifted from the people who truly mattered. But when fate gives him a second chance to rebuild what he lost, will it be too late? Stay tuned, because this is a journey about love, regret, and the possibility of redemption. And make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. Ethan Wilkins stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling mirror in his penthouse, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored shirt. The sharp lines of his suit seemed to match the precision with which he lived his life, controlled, calculated, and always in motion. His reflection gazed back at him, but he barely noticed. He was too accustomed to the man he had become over the years, a millionaire with a bustling empire of real estate holdings, a successful venture capital firm, and a reputation that often preceded him in any room he entered. His phone buzzed on the polished marble counter, a reminder of the next deal waiting for his attention. His fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, the temptation to answer always there. But this time he set it aside. He had promised himself that today he would take a break, even if it was only for a few hours. The demands of his business could wait, and the deals could be signed tomorrow. Ethan had built his life on the idea that success was the key to happiness. It was a philosophy he'd cultivated after losing Sophie, his ex-wife. When they first met, it had been everything he'd ever wanted. She was his anchor, balancing his ambitious nature with her warmth and grounding presence. Sophie believed in love, in building a life together, in nurturing their family. But Ethan had been too focused on building his empire, too caught up in the allure of money and status. He missed the little things, like their late-night talks or the way her laughter filled the house. He'd let his work consume him until one day Sophie had packed up and left, taking their son Lucas with her. The end of their marriage had been swift, like a cold gust of wind that swept everything away without a second glance. No matter how much he tried to convince himself that business success was all that mattered, he knew deep down that something was missing. As Ethan left his apartment and stepped into the sleek black car waiting for him outside, he couldn't help but wonder how things would be if he'd prioritized Sophie and Lucas over his ambitions. Would they still be a family? Would he have found happiness in other ways? The drive to the luxury store was uneventful, a brief blur of city streets and the hum of the car's engine. Ethan's mind drifted between his usual thoughts: the next investment opportunity, the board meeting in 2 days, the charity gala he'd been invited to next week. It all felt routine, as if he were running on autopilot. The store was just as he expected. High ceilings, pristine marble floors, walls adorned with artwork, and glass shelves filled with the latest designer collections. Ethan barely took a second glance at the merchandise. He'd been here countless times, buying gifts for clients, or simply treating himself to something new. Yet today, something was different. Today, he had an odd sense of detachment, as if the world around him was moving on without him. He was walking past the section where high-end watches were displayed when he saw her, Sophie. For a moment, he thought his eyes were playing tricks on him. His heart skipped a beat as he stood frozen in the aisle, unable to look away. There she was, standing near the jewelry display with their son, Lucas. Sophie was dressed in a flowing red dress, her hair pulled back loosely, her expression calm yet focused. She was older, but the lines around her eyes had only deepened her beauty, making her look even more striking than before. Beside her, Lucas was holding a shopping bag, looking at something in his phone, with a slight smile on his face. The sight of them together was a punch to Ethan's gut. He hadn't seen either of them in years, since the divorce, since he'd chosen his work over everything else. He didn't know why, but he felt as though he had no right to approach them. He wasn't sure if it was the passage of time or the wall he'd built around himself, but suddenly, standing there in the same room as Sophie, Everything felt raw. Too raw. Ethan's first instinct was to turn and walk away, to retreat to the comfort of his carefully curated life where no one challenged his choices. But as he stood there, staring at them, something inside him stirred, a familiar ache, a longing for the family he had once taken for granted. Sophie turned, her eyes scanning the room. Their gazes met, and for a moment, everything around them disappeared. Time slowed down, and the years of separation, of silence, felt like a distant memory. Sophie blinked, almost as if she couldn't believe it either, but then her face softened, the tension melting away. "Ethan?" Her voice was hesitant, but not unkind. He took a few steps toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no script for this moment, no plan for how to react or what to say. He simply knew he needed to speak, needed to bridge the gap that had formed between them all those years ago. "Sophie, it's been a long time," Ethan said, the words sounding foreign in his mouth. He cleared his throat, feeling awkward but unsure of how to fix it. "You look amazing." Sophie's smile was warm but distant. It wasn't the smile of someone who had spent years longing for him to return. No, this was the smile of someone who had built her own life, someone who had learned to live without him. "I've had to adapt," Sophie said, her voice steady. "And you're looking well, Ethan." Lucas looked up from his phone and raised an eyebrow, his expression guarded. "Dad?" he said, his voice unsure but curious. Ethan's chest tightened. Seeing Lucas again, his son, now taller, more mature, struck him in a way he hadn't anticipated. There was a moment of silence, a pregnant pause, as Ethan searched for the right words to break the ice. "I didn't know you were back in town," Ethan said, trying to sound casual, even though his emotions were anything but. Sophie nodded. "We moved back a few months ago. It felt like the right time for Lucas, and for me. Things have changed, for both of us." Ethan noticed the shift in Sophie's tone, the hint of something new, something she hadn't shared with him before. He wanted to ask, to understand what had been going on in her life, but he didn't know how to start. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to her words. "Can we sit down?" Sophie suggested, her gaze softening as she motioned toward the lounge area. "There's a lot we need to talk about." Ethan hesitated for a moment, but then nodded, following her toward the seating area. Lucas trailed behind, still holding the shopping bag, as though it were a shield against the tension that seemed to hang in the air. As they sat, Sophie turned to Ethan, her eyes unwavering. "There's something I've been working on," she said, her voice quiet but filled with determination. "I'm starting a business, a boutique, something I've always dreamed of doing." Ethan raised an eyebrow, impressed but also surprised. He hadn't expected this. Sophie, his ex-wife, had always been the supportive partner, the one who'd put her own aspirations aside for the family. Yet here she was, reclaiming her life, building something entirely on her own. "It's amazing," Ethan said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "You're really doing it, Sophie." She nodded, but there was an edge to her voice now, a quiet strength that Ethan hadn't seen before. "It's not easy, Ethan. Raising Lucas on my own, keeping everything together, it's not just a business. It's a way to prove that I can make it on my own, that we can." Ethan felt a pang of guilt shoot through him. "I should have been there," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "You weren't, Ethan. And for a long time I thought maybe you didn't want to be." The words cut deeper than he expected, but they were true. Sophie had built a new life without him, and as much as he regretted it, he knew he couldn't undo the past. Still, there was a flicker of hope, small, fragile but real, that perhaps, just perhaps, they could find a way forward together. Ethan sat back in the plush chair, the leather creaking slightly under his weight. But it was the heavy silence between him and Sophie that was truly unbearable. His eyes shifted to Lucas, who had settled into a seat across from them, his body language stiff, arms crossed protectively. It was clear that Ethan's sudden reappearance wasn't something Lucas had been anticipating. The tension in the air felt thick, and Ethan wasn't sure how to break it. He wanted to reach out, to apologize, to reconnect, but the distance between them, both emotional and physical, seemed too vast to cross in a single conversation. Sophie cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "So, how have you been, Ethan?" Her voice was calm, almost detached, as though she had long accepted that their paths had diverged. There was no bitterness in her tone, just an air of quiet curiosity, as if she was genuinely wondering what had become of him after all these years. Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the simplicity of the question. He had spent so many years filling the gaps of his life with success and work that he had never really paused to reflect on who he was now, on what he had become in Sophie's absence. "I'm good. Things are moving fast, you know, the business. It's always been my focus." Ethan's words came out more hollow than he intended, as though the weight of the years without Sophie had caught up to him in that single moment. Sophie's gaze softened, but only slightly. "I always knew you'd be successful, Ethan. You always had that drive. I just wish we had been able to share it together." The ache in her voice hit him like a physical blow. For a fleeting moment he saw the young woman he had fallen in love with, the one who had believed in him when he wasn't sure if he believed in himself. She had sacrificed so much for him, for their family, and yet he had pushed her aside without a second thought. "I didn't know how to balance it all. I thought I was doing the right thing, providing for us, but I wasn't really present, was I?" Ethan's voice was thick with regret now, each word coming slowly, as though pulling itself from the deepest part of him. He didn't want to excuse his behavior, didn't want to give the impression that he was only now recognizing his mistakes for the sake of convenience. Sophie looked down, her fingers idly playing with the edge of the shopping bag Lucas had set down next to her. The faintest sigh escaped her lips before she spoke, but it wasn't one of anger or resentment. It was one of acceptance, as though she had let go of that particular pain long ago. "No, you weren't. You were never really there. And I had to make a choice, Ethan. I had to choose what was best for Lucas and me, and I couldn't keep waiting for you to come around. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me either." Ethan's heart sank as he listened to her words. He knew it was the truth, but hearing it out loud from Sophie, the woman he had once promised the world to, felt like an even harsher reality than he'd anticipated. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect anything, really," Ethan said, his eyes focusing on the floor, unable to hold her gaze for long. He wasn't sure what he was seeking. Maybe redemption, maybe understanding, but all he could feel was the sting of his own failure. Sophie didn't speak right away. Instead, she reached for her bag, pulling out a small leather planner. She opened it slowly, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages before she met Ethan's eyes once more. "I've started something, Ethan. I'm starting a business. I've been planning it for months now. It's not just a hobby or a side project. It's something I'm doing for myself, for Lucas, and for my future," Sophie said, her voice gaining strength with each word, like she was shedding a skin that had held her back for far too long. There was no hesitation in her voice now, only conviction, and the kind of pride that only comes when someone has rebuilt themselves from the ground up. Ethan's mind spun as he took in her words. Sophie, his Sophie, the one who had always put others before herself, was carving out her own space in the world. It was a revelation that both stunned and inspired him. "Starting your own business?" he asked, though it was more of a statement than a question. "Sophie, that's incredible. I never knew you wanted to do something like that. I mean, you've always had the talent, the eye for design, but—" Sophie raised her hand, cutting him off gently. "I know. I never had the time when we were together. I always put it aside for you, for Lucas. But now it's time for me." Her words, quiet yet full of determination, hit Ethan like a wave. He had always thought of Sophie as the supportive wife, the one who helped hold everything together while he chased his dreams. But now, she was chasing hers. She wasn't waiting for his approval or his help. She had forged her own path. Ethan swallowed hard, trying to keep the emotions that were bubbling up inside him under control. "I'm proud of you, Sophie, I really am, but can I help? I know we're not together anymore, but I want to support you. If you need anything, anything at all." Sophie regarded him carefully, her gaze steady and unflinching. She didn't rush her answer, taking a moment to think it over. "I appreciate that, Ethan, I really do. But I've worked hard for this, and I need to know that I can do it on my own. I don't want anyone's pity or help because they feel sorry for me. I want to prove to myself and to Lucas that I can build something from scratch. I've spent so long living in your shadow. Now it's my turn to step into the light." Her words were like a quiet declaration, a testament to the strength she had developed over the years, strength he hadn't fully recognized until now. The woman sitting across from him was not the same person who had left him all those years ago. She was someone entirely different, stronger, more self-assured, and determined to never rely on anyone again. Ethan could feel the weight of her words settling in his chest. She didn't need him, not anymore, and that realization stung. But then something else flickered within him. It was a quiet hope, a faint ember that perhaps, just perhaps, this was the first step toward something more. Toward forgiveness, toward growth, toward rebuilding, not just with words but with actions. "I get it, Sophie. I do. I just want to make things right. I want to be part of your life again, Lucas's life. I can't undo the past, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make up for it, if you'll let me." Sophie didn't answer immediately. She glanced at Lucas, who was looking at them both now, his expression unreadable. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice gentle yet firm. "We'll see, Ethan. But actions speak louder than words." And with that, the conversation took a quieter turn as Sophie began to explain more about her business plans, about the challenges she faced, and the dreams she had for her future. Ethan listened, truly listened as she spoke. And for the first time in years, he realized that the future wasn't just about what he could build, it was about what they could build together, but only if he could prove himself worthy of that second chance. Ethan's mind swirled as Sophie's words lingered in the air, heavier than the soft hum of the store around them. He had expected many things when he ran into her today, surprise, maybe even anger, but he had never anticipated this. Sophie wasn't angry, she wasn't bitter. She was resolute, her strength unmistakable as she spoke about her new venture. It was as though she had taken everything that had once been broken between them, everything she had sacrificed, and had woven it into something unshakable, something just for her. The pride in her voice as she described her boutique was something Ethan hadn't heard from her in years, not since the early days of their marriage when they'd first discussed their dreams together. Back then, they had shared everything: hope, ambition, vision for the future. But he had let his career take over, drowning out her aspirations in the process. Now, seeing her here, with that quiet fire in her eyes, he realized just how much he had lost, how much he had ignored. Sophie's business wasn't just a project, it was a declaration of independence, a refusal to stay in the shadows. It was the embodiment of everything she had fought for after their divorce, a testament to her resilience and determination. As she spoke about the challenges she faced, her eyes never wavered. She wasn't asking for sympathy or pity. Sophie didn't need him or anyone else to validate her success. She had already validated herself. Ethan had no idea how long they had been sitting there, but the passage of time seemed irrelevant now. His thoughts were fixed on her, the woman who had once been his everything, the mother of his child, and now a woman who had rebuilt herself from the ground up. How could he have been so blind? Sophie paused, looking at him, her expression softening ever so slightly. "I know you probably think I'm just being stubborn," she said, her tone lighter than it had been before, "but I've worked too hard for this. I've put everything I have into it. I don't want to fail. I can't fail." Ethan felt a pang in his chest at the vulnerability in her voice. He realized that for all her strength, Sophie had her fears too, fears she hadn't shared with anyone, not even him. And that frightened him. He wanted to be the one to support her, to stand by her side this time. But there was so much distance between them now, so much to make up for. He wasn't sure how to bridge that gap. "I'm not asking you to fail," he said quietly, his voice betraying the weight of his regret. "I'm asking you to let me help, to let me show you that I can be there for you, for Lucas too." Sophie's gaze shifted away from him briefly, her eyes flickering toward the window of the store. The light filtered through the glass, casting soft shadows across her face. She didn't respond immediately, but Ethan could see the internal battle playing out in her mind. She was still processing his words, still deciding whether she could trust him again after everything he had done, or failed to do. "I don't know, Ethan," she finally replied, her voice quieter now but still firm. "I can't just forget what happened. You weren't there when I needed you. You weren't there when Lucas needed you." Her voice cracked slightly at the mention of their son, and for the briefest of moments, Ethan saw a flicker of pain in Sophie's eyes, quickly masked by her usual composure. Ethan's heart tightened. He had known the depth of his failures, but hearing Sophie speak of it so plainly hit him harder than anything else. The years he had lost, the moments he had missed with Lucas, it all seemed like such a colossal waste now. Sophie was right. He had been absent when they needed him most. "I can't change the past," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can change now. I can be the man you and Lucas need, if you'll give me that chance." Sophie let out a slow breath, her eyes still avoiding his. There was a long pause, one that seemed to stretch endlessly between them, filled with unspoken words and possibilities. She wasn't dismissing him outright, but the hesitation was clear. Ethan knew he couldn't rush this. He couldn't expect her to forgive him overnight, and he certainly couldn't expect her to forget everything that had come before. After a long while, Sophie finally spoke, her voice softer this time, almost as if she were talking to herself. "I don't know, Ethan. I don't know if I can just let you in like that again. We've both changed. You've changed, but so have I." "I know," Ethan replied, his voice steady. "I'm not asking for everything at once. Just give me a chance to prove that I'm different now, that I'm not the man who failed you before." Sophie met his gaze then, her eyes searching his, as though trying to decipher the truth in his words. There was a quiet strength in her silence, an understanding that whatever decision she made now would be a step forward, either toward rebuilding something between them or toward continuing on separate paths. "I don't know if I can trust you, Ethan," Sophie said finally. "But I'll think about it. I'll think about what it would look like for us to maybe start over. But not right now. I need time." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I'll give you all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of everything hanging between them. Sophie reached for her bag, closing it with deliberate care, and Lucas stood up, stretching his arms before looking at his mother and Ethan. There was a quiet understanding between the three of them, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. Lucas didn't speak, but his presence alone made it clear that even if his father was trying to reach out, he wasn't sure what to make of it yet. "I'm proud of you, Mum," Lucas said, his voice surprisingly soft as he looked at Sophie. His words were simple, but they carried an emotion Ethan hadn't expected. His son was proud of Sophie, of the strength she had shown, of the life she had built. Ethan couldn't help but feel a pang of jealousy mixed with admiration. He had missed out on so much with Lucas, and there was no getting that time back. Ethan forced a smile, his eyes following Lucas as he headed toward the door. "I'm proud of you too, Lucas," he said, the words feeling strange on his tongue. "I've missed a lot, but I'd like to make up for that." Lucas didn't respond, but he nodded briefly before stepping out. It was clear that he wasn't ready to open up to Ethan just yet. Understandable, given the years of absence. But Ethan was determined to change that. He had a long road ahead of him, but he was finally starting to understand what he needed to do. Sophie stood up, pulling her coat around her shoulders. She didn't look at Ethan, but there was something in the way she moved, something that told him she wasn't quite as closed off as she had been when they first sat down. She was still cautious, still wary of the man he had been, but there was a glimmer of hope there too. "I'll see you around, Ethan," Sophie said softly, her voice calm but distant. Ethan stood as well, his heart heavy, but his resolve stronger than it had been in years. "I'll be here," he replied, his voice steady. "I'll wait, whenever you're ready." Sophie gave him one last look before turning to leave, and Ethan watched her go. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of possibility, not just for his business, but for something much more important, a chance to rebuild the family he had lost. It wasn't going to be easy, but he was ready to fight for it. For the first time in a long time, Ethan believed in second chances, and he was determined to prove that he deserved one. Ethan sat in his office the next morning, the city skyline stretching endlessly before him, but the view no longer offered the same sense of satisfaction it once did. The same glass walls that had once symbolized his success now felt like a barrier, enclosing him in a world that no longer held the appeal it had when he first built this empire. His fingers drummed against his desk, but his mind was elsewhere, on Sophie, on Lucas, and on the fragile thread that connected him to them now. The weight of yesterday's conversation lingered, wrapping itself around his thoughts, twisting with his guilt and his determination. Sophie had said she needed time. She hadn't rejected him outright, but she hadn't embraced him either. He understood that. She had every right to be cautious, to test the waters before she let him back into her life. It was not going to be a smooth path, not after the years he had spent building walls between them. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not this time. He had told her that he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. The words had felt genuine when they left his lips, but now, in the silence of his office, they seemed to carry more weight than he had anticipated. He needed to back up those words with actions, actions that would speak louder than anything he could say. But how could he begin? What did she need from him? And more importantly, what did Lucas need? Ethan stood up abruptly, the decision crystallizing in his mind. He couldn't wait for Sophie to come to him. If he truly wanted to be a part of their lives again, he had to show them that he was serious about this. He had to prove that he wasn't the man who had neglected them for so long. He grabbed his coat and headed out of the office, dialing Sophie's number on his phone as he walked to the elevator. The buzz of the city outside seemed distant, muffled by the rush of his thoughts. When Sophie answered, her voice still held that same reserved calm from yesterday. But Ethan could hear the hesitation behind it. He had no intention of letting that hesitation stand in his way. "Sophie," he began, his tone softer than usual. "I've been thinking about our conversation, and I know I can't just show up and expect everything to be okay. But I want to prove to you that I'm serious about being there for you and Lucas. I want to help with your business. I know you said you wanted to do it on your own, and I respect that. But I can offer you more than just money. I can offer my time, my expertise, whatever you need." There was a long pause on the other end, and Ethan could almost feel the walls Sophie had built in her heart, slowly shifting. Just a fraction. "I don't know if that's a good idea, Ethan," Sophie finally replied, her voice hesitant but not dismissive. "I appreciate that you want to help, but I don't want it to feel like I'm depending on you. I don't want to fall back into old patterns. I've worked so hard to get where I am now." "I understand," Ethan said, his voice steady, "but that's not what I want. I'm not trying to take over or make you feel like you're not capable. I'm offering to stand by you, to help you grow this thing, together. I'll be whatever you need me to be, but this time I'll be there." Sophie didn't respond immediately, and for a moment Ethan feared that he had pushed too hard. But then she spoke again, her voice quieter this time. "Let's meet tomorrow afternoon. We can talk more about what this would look like." Ethan felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a yes, not yet, but it was something, a step forward. "Thank you, Sophie. I'll be there. And I'll prove it to you." The line went quiet, and as Sophie hung up, Ethan stood in the middle of his office, staring out at the city below. The weight of what lay ahead was still heavy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of hope. Sophie hadn't shut him out completely. She was willing to listen, and that, for now, was enough. The following afternoon, Ethan stood outside the small boutique Sophie had rented, taking in the sight of the store for the first time. The building was tucked between two larger, more established shops in a quiet part of the city, far from the bustling luxury district that Ethan was accustomed to. It wasn't grand, but there was something quietly beautiful about it. The soft glow of the lights spilling out onto the sidewalk, the simple elegance of the storefront. It felt like something Sophie would create, something real. As he pushed open the door, the familiar scent of freshly cut wood and new fabrics filled the air. Inside, the space was small but welcoming, with shelves lined with beautiful minimalist designs. The walls were painted in soft, neutral tones, and every piece of furniture and decor was carefully chosen. Ethan could feel the thought and effort Sophie had put into every corner of this space, and it took everything in him to push down the swelling pride he felt. Sophie was standing near the counter, looking through a stack of papers. She looked up as he entered, her face softening slightly when she saw him. There was still a certain wariness in her eyes, but it was tempered by something else. Maybe curiosity, maybe even a little hope. "Thanks for coming," Sophie said, her voice still guarded. "I wasn't sure if you would actually show up." Ethan smiled gently. "I told you I would, and I meant it." Sophie nodded, folding her arms across her chest as she stepped toward him. "So, what exactly do you think you can offer? I don't need a business partner, Ethan. I don't want anyone to take over. But if you're serious about helping, then maybe we can talk." Ethan took a deep breath, focusing on her words. He wasn't here to take over. He wasn't here to fix everything with his wealth or influence. He was here to prove that he could be a true partner, someone who understood the value of what Sophie had created. "I don't want to take over, Sophie," he said firmly, "but I do know how to help a business grow. I can provide financial support, yes, but more than that, I can offer strategy, marketing advice, and help you navigate the challenges you're facing. You don't have to do this alone." Sophie studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "And why should I trust you? After everything?" Ethan paused, the words he had rehearsed in his mind seeming inadequate now. But he didn't shy away. "Because I've learned a lot about myself these past few years. And I've learned that the things that matter, real connections, real love, real family, are worth more than anything I've built here." He motioned to the city outside, the empire he had built. "I've learned that success is meaningless without the people you love." Sophie didn't respond immediately, but her eyes softened as she looked at him. She didn't say anything, but for the first time, Ethan felt like he wasn't just being seen. He was being heard, and that, in itself, was a small victory. "Okay," Sophie finally said, her voice steady but not unkind. "Let's give it a try, but I'm in charge here. We'll go at my pace." Ethan smiled, a genuine smile, not one of relief but of understanding. "That's all I ask." As the two of them sat down to discuss the details of Sophie's business and how he could support her, Ethan realized that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would require patience, understanding, and most of all, respect for the woman Sophie had become. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose that wasn't tied to his business, but to something far more important, his family. And as he looked across the table at Sophie, he knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where actions would speak louder than words, where trust would be rebuilt, and where second chances might just turn into something lasting. It was late in the afternoon when he decided to stop by the boutique again, the decision coming to him with a clarity that almost felt urgent. There was something he needed to do, some step he needed to take, something beyond words, beyond the promises he had made. As he arrived, the store was quieter than the day before, with only a few customers browsing through the racks. Sophie was standing behind the counter, looking over a few inventory reports, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't look up when he entered, and for a moment Ethan hesitated. He wondered if she even wanted to see him today. But then she looked up, her gaze meeting his, and there was something in her eyes that made him feel as if this, whatever it was between them, was slowly starting to shift. "Ethan," she greeted, her voice calm but neutral. "What brings you here?" Ethan swallowed, pushing aside the remnants of doubt that had been clouding his mind. "I've been thinking," he began, his tone quieter than usual. "I know you're not looking for help with the day-to-day stuff, but I've been doing some thinking about how I can contribute more. I want to help you build this, Sophie, not just with money, but with actual strategy. I want to prove to you that I'm serious about being here for you, for Lucas." Sophie raised an eyebrow but didn't interrupt. Instead, she gestured for him to take a seat in the small seating area near the front window. The store was empty, save for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the faint music playing in the background. It was a peaceful space, and in the quiet, Ethan felt the weight of his words. He sat down, taking a deep breath before continuing. "I've been thinking about how we could expand the boutique's reach, how we could make it more than just a local business. Maybe we could look at partnerships with designers, or explore some online options. We could expand your brand." Sophie listened intently, her gaze never wavering from his face, but her expression was still carefully guarded. She didn't seem surprised by his ideas, but there was a certain skepticism in her eyes that Ethan could not ignore. She was used to standing on her own, used to making things work with limited resources and no help from him. He understood why she was cautious. He would have been too if he were in her shoes. "I appreciate your ideas, Ethan," Sophie said slowly, her voice measured, "but I've built this business from the ground up. I've done everything myself. I've learned how to manage every aspect, inventory, customer relations, budgeting, without anyone's help. And I'm not just going to give all of that away because someone says they want to help." Ethan felt a pang of frustration, but he didn't let it show. Sophie was right to be cautious, and he knew that he had no intention of taking control or undermining her efforts. This wasn't about him stepping in and taking over. It was about finding a way to support her without taking away the sense of independence she had fought so hard to maintain. "I'm not here to take over, Sophie," he said, his voice steady now. "I'm here to be a partner, not in the way I've been in the past, where I dictated everything. This time, I want to help you with the things you don't want to deal with, things like marketing, partnerships, strategy. I don't want to run your business. I just want to give you the tools you need to make it grow, if that's something you're willing to consider." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She stood there, her arms crossed in front of her, looking at him with an intensity that almost felt like a test. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her mind, the careful consideration she was giving to his offer. The quiet moments stretched on, each one more unbearable than the last. But he didn't break the silence. He let her think. Finally, Sophie sighed, the tension in her posture easing slightly. "Okay," she said, her voice quieter than before. "I'm willing to listen, but this is on my terms, Ethan. I need to maintain control. This business is my baby, and I'm not just going to hand it over to someone else, even if that someone is you." Ethan nodded, a quiet sense of relief flooding through him. It wasn't a yes, not completely, but it was progress. It was the first step in proving himself, not just as a business partner, but as someone who understood the weight of her independence, the importance of her work. "I understand," he said simply. "We'll go at your pace. No pressure, but I'll be here when you're ready." Sophie seemed to consider this for a moment, her expression softening slightly. "I appreciate that, Ethan. I really do." As they spoke, Lucas entered the boutique, his face lighting up when he saw his mother. He made his way to the counter, exchanging a few quick words with her before he turned to Ethan. The distance between them was still palpable, But Lucas didn't seem as hostile as before. Maybe it was the slow recognition that Ethan was serious. Maybe it was the fact that he had been more present these past few days. But for the first time in a long while, there was a flicker of something else in Lucas's gaze. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe even a hint of hope. Ethan forced himself to smile, trying to ease the tension. "Hey, Lucas. How's school going?" Lucas gave him a guarded look, but nodded. "It's fine," he said, his voice not entirely dismissive. "Got a lot of homework, but I'm handling it." Ethan nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. If you ever need anything, let me know. I'm around." Lucas didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on Ethan for a moment before he turned to his mother again. Sophie watched the exchange, her expression unreadable, but Ethan felt a flicker of something between them, something that perhaps with time would begin to heal. As the afternoon stretched on, Ethan helped Sophie organize some of the back-end materials for the boutique. Nothing extravagant, just simple tasks that allowed him to show her that he was genuinely committed. There were moments of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt like the first time in a long while that they were both on the same page, working towards something, even if it was just small steps. By the time Ethan left the boutique that evening, the weight he had been carrying over the past days had lifted, just a little. Sophie wasn't ready to let him back into her life completely, but she was willing to let him help. And that, for now, was enough. The road ahead would be long, there would be challenges, there would be moments of doubt, but Ethan was starting to believe that second chances weren't just about fixing the past. They were about proving that the present could be different. He had a long way to go before he could fully regain Sophie's trust, before he could rebuild the family he had once neglected. But as he stepped out into the cool evening air, he knew one thing for sure: he was willing to do whatever it took to get there. The mornings had become slower for Ethan, a mix of anticipation and uncertainty hanging over him like a fog that wouldn't lift. Each day that passed without Sophie's full trust was another day he had to prove himself, another day where he had to learn the delicate balance of respecting her independence while still offering his support. It was an unfamiliar territory for him, one where he was forced to step back and listen, not just act. But it was necessary. One afternoon, a week after his last visit, Ethan found himself walking into the boutique again, feeling a familiar sense of uncertainty. He had arranged to meet Sophie to discuss a potential partnership with a local designer, a collaboration that could help give her business more visibility. It wasn't a big move, but it was a significant one, and it was exactly the kind of opportunity Sophie had once dreamed about, but hadn't yet pursued on her own. When he arrived, Sophie was already there, going over some papers at the counter. Her posture was relaxed, but Ethan could sense the quiet intensity in her movements. She was focused, determined, much like the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. The woman who had always put everyone else's needs before her own, who had supported him in ways he hadn't always appreciated. But this Sophie, the one sitting at the counter, was different. She was no longer waiting for anyone's permission to succeed. She had made it clear that she was in control of her own life, her own choices. "Hey," Ethan greeted her, his voice soft but purposeful. Sophie looked up, her expression neutral as always, but there was something in her eyes today, something that told him she wasn't as distant as she had been before. Maybe it was the partnership they were about to discuss, or maybe, just maybe, it was something deeper. "Hi, Ethan," she replied, her tone polite but not warm. Still, the edge that had been there before seemed to have dulled a little. "I've been thinking about that collaboration. I'm not sure if it's the right move yet, but I'm open to hearing more." Ethan nodded, taking a seat across from her. He had prepared for this moment, but it still felt like a step into unknown territory. The balance between pushing forward and respecting her boundaries was delicate. He had to be careful. "I think it could give your brand the exposure it needs. Plus, it would bring in a new customer base. The designer has a solid reputation, and their aesthetic aligns with yours. It could be a great fit. Sophie hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the papers in front of her. Ethan could see the wheels turning in her mind. She was considering it, weighing the pros and cons, just like she always did. "I don't know, Ethan," Sophie said slowly, her voice thoughtful. "I've worked so hard to keep this business authentic. I've always been very careful about who I align with. I don't want to lose that just for the sake of exposure." Ethan leaned forward slightly, trying to choose his words carefully. "I understand. I'm not suggesting you compromise your values, but this could be an opportunity to grow without losing what makes your brand unique. You don't have to change who you are to get the attention you deserve." Sophie looked at him then, her gaze intense, as if she were searching for something in his eyes. For a moment, the space between them felt charged with more than just business. It was as if she was seeing him, not just the man who had come to offer help, but the man who was truly trying to understand her, truly trying to show her that he had changed. "Maybe you're right," Sophie said, her voice quieter now. "Maybe I need to take some risks. Maybe I've been holding back too much. But I won't just let anyone in. I need to trust that it's the right move for the business. And for me." Ethan smiled, relieved that she was at least considering it. He knew that this wasn't just about business. It was about building the trust that had been fractured all those years ago, the trust he had failed to build in the first place. He had learned the hard way that trust wasn't something you could demand. It was something you had to earn, step by step, moment by moment. "I understand," he said softly, "and I'm not asking you to jump into anything. I just want you to know that I'm here to help you whenever you're ready." Sophie didn't say anything at first, but the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence that spoke of things unsaid, of a bridge being built slowly, piece by piece. She nodded after a moment, a small but significant gesture. "I'll think about it, but I appreciate that you're here." Ethan stood up, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment, not for the business deal, but for the way the conversation had shifted. Sophie had let him in, even if only a little. And for now, that was enough. Later that evening, after the store had closed, Sophie and Ethan found themselves walking down the quiet streets of the neighborhood. The city was still, the hum of traffic a distant memory, and the world seemed smaller somehow, as if the distance between them had lessened in the hours they had spent together. That Friday afternoon, Sophie invited Ethan back to the boutique, asking him to meet her after hours to discuss the partnership with the designer. She had made a decision, and as he stood outside the store, waiting for her to open the door, Ethan couldn't help but feel a mix of anticipation and nerves. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about Sophie trusting him enough to let him back into her life, even in this small way. When Sophie opened the door, the familiar warmth of the boutique spilled out into the evening air. She greeted him with a soft smile, and for the first time in days, Ethan felt like he was seeing a glimpse of the woman he used to know, the woman who had once been his partner, who had believed in him even when he wasn't sure of himself. "Hey," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I've thought about it, and I think you're right. This collaboration with the designer could help. It's a risk, but it's one I'm willing to take." Ethan's heart lifted at her words, but he remained calm, not wanting to show too much excitement. "I'm glad you're open to it," he said simply. "We can take it slow, make sure it feels right for you." Sophie nodded as they walked further into the store, her eyes flickering over the shelves of carefully arranged designs. "I want to make sure that this business grows in a way that feels authentic. I don't want to compromise just for the sake of popularity, but I also don't want to stay small because I'm scared of failure." Ethan could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to grow, to expand, but the fear of losing control over her vision held her back. It was the same fear she had shared with him on their first meeting, the fear of stepping into new territory and not being able to manage it all. "You don't have to do it alone, Sophie," Ethan said, his voice gentle but firm. "You've already built something incredible. I just want to help you take it to the next level. I'm not here to push you into anything you're not ready for, but you don't have to carry the weight of it all on your own anymore." Sophie paused, her eyes lingering on him, searching for something. maybe sincerity, maybe the commitment she hadn't fully seen before. "It's not that I don't trust you, Ethan," she said, her voice softening. "I'm just afraid of what could happen if things don't go the way I hope. I've worked too hard for this, and I don't want to lose everything just because I took a chance on someone." Ethan's heart tightened at her words. He could feel the depth of her fear, the weight of her past decisions, and the scars they had left. She had sacrificed so much to get here, and now the fear of failure loomed larger than ever. "You won't lose everything," Ethan said, his voice low but filled with conviction. "You've built something solid, something real, and I'm not going to let anything happen to it. I'll be with you every step of the way." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. "I don't know if I'm ready to let go of the reins entirely," she said, almost as if she were speaking to herself. "But maybe we can start small. We'll take one step at a time and see how it goes." Ethan smiled, his chest swelling with quiet relief. "One step at a time. That's all I'm asking." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings, calls, and late nights spent strategizing. Sophie's collaboration with the designer began to take shape, and they launched their first joint marketing campaign. Ethan stayed in the background, offering his expertise where it was needed, but never pushing Sophie beyond what she was comfortable with. Slowly, but surely, the business began to gain attention. The partnership brought in new customers, and the boutique's online presence grew. Sophie's brand was expanding, but it wasn't at the cost of the authenticity she had fought so hard to preserve. Through it all, Ethan kept his promise to Sophie. He was there for the small things, the endless emails, the late-night brainstorming sessions, and the quiet moments when she needed someone to bounce ideas off of. But it wasn't just about the business. He was there, showing up in ways he hadn't before. He was there for Lucas, too. He started attending more of Lucas's school events, taking an interest in the things that mattered to him. It wasn't about being a father figure, but it was about being present, about rebuilding a relationship with the son he had once neglected. It wasn't easy. There were awkward moments, silences that spoke louder than words, and moments of doubt where both Sophie and Ethan wondered if they were doing the right thing. But with each passing day, the walls between them began to crack, bit by bit. It wasn't a smooth process, and it certainly wasn't perfect, but they were learning to navigate this new chapter together, and that, in itself, felt like a victory. One evening, about a month into their collaboration, Sophie invited Ethan to join her for a quiet dinner at her place, a small step toward rebuilding the personal connection between them. It was a simple dinner, nothing extravagant, but for Ethan, it was everything. As they sat together, talking about their days, their hopes, and their small victories, Ethan couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in years, he felt like he was on the right path. He had no illusions about what he had to make up for. But he also knew that this journey they were on was worth the fight. It wasn't just about business. It was about family, about love, about second chances. Sophie looked at him across the table, her expression softening, as if she were seeing him in a new light, perhaps for the first time in a long time. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said quietly. "I'm glad we're doing this together." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling at her words. "Me too, Sophie. Me too." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, they were finally finding their way back to each other. The weeks that followed their dinner felt like a turning point. Sophie had made her peace with the idea of Ethan being involved in her business, but now the real test began. Could they continue to work together without the weight of their past pulling them back? Every day felt like a step closer to something that could be truly lasting, but it was fragile, built on the tentative trust they had begun to rebuild. Their days were still filled with tasks, running the boutique, managing inventory, responding to customer feedback. The business was growing, but more than that, Sophie and Ethan were learning to navigate their new dynamic. There were still moments of tension, small missteps where old habits resurfaced, but they were gradually finding a rhythm. For the first time in years, Ethan felt needed, not just in the business, but in Sophie's life. There were times when they would sit together after hours, discussing ideas for the store, sharing small personal stories. Sophie's guard had come down a little, but there were still things she wasn't ready to discuss. There were still the scars of the past, still the remnants of all the times she had felt abandoned. Ethan could feel the weight of it, but he also knew that it would take time. They were taking it slow, not rushing, and for the first time, he understood that true healing couldn't be hurried. One afternoon, while they were working through a particularly challenging inventory issue, Lucas stopped by the boutique. Sophie's face brightened when she saw him, and Ethan could see the subtle shift in her demeanor. Lucas was still distant with him, but Ethan knew that rebuilding a relationship with him would take patience. He wasn't going to rush it, wasn't going to force something that wasn't ready. Instead, he greeted Lucas warmly, making an effort to engage him without pushing too hard. "How's school going?" Ethan asked, trying to make small talk. "It's fine," Lucas replied, his voice guarded but not cold. "Busy, but I'm managing." Ethan nodded, grateful for the simple interaction. "If you ever need help with anything, homework, school projects, whatever, I'm here." Lucas gave a brief nod, and for a moment their eyes met. It wasn't a moment of warmth, but it wasn't as cold as before. It was something, a flicker of recognition, and that was all Ethan could ask for. Slowly but surely the pieces were coming together, even if they were just fragments at the moment. Sophie and Ethan continued to work side by side, their partnership growing stronger with each passing day. But with growth came new challenges. They started facing difficulties in their expansion plans, logistical issues, supply chain delays, and unforeseen financial setbacks. It was the first real test for Sophie's business since it had begun to take off, and she felt the pressure more than ever. One evening, after a particularly stressful meeting with a potential new supplier, Sophie was visibly exhausted. Ethan had stayed behind to help her sort through some paperwork, trying to find a solution to the latest setback. He could see the strain in her eyes, the weight of the business pressing down on her. He knew this was a pivotal moment, one that could either break them or bring them closer together. "Sophie, I know this is a lot to deal with," Ethan said softly, his voice low, not wanting to add to her stress. "But you don't have to carry it all on your own. Let me help. You've built something incredible here, and I want to see it succeed. But you don't have to do it alone." Sophie looked up at him, her face tired but softened by the sincerity in his words. "I don't want to admit how much this is getting to me," she said quietly. "I've spent so long doing this by myself, and I'm scared that if I let go of control, it'll all fall apart." Ethan walked over to her, standing beside her in the quiet space of the boutique. "Letting go doesn't mean losing control. It means trusting someone else to help you carry the weight. You don't have to do everything alone, Sophie. I'm here." Sophie sat there for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the desk in front of her. Finally, she sighed, a deep, weary sound. I know it's just hard to let go, to trust again." Ethan reached over, gently placing his hand over hers. "I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. But little by little, we can figure this out together." The simple gesture, the way Sophie allowed it to happen without pulling away, felt like another step forward. She wasn't ready to fully let go, but she was starting to open up, and that, Ethan knew, was enough for now. As the months passed, the business continued to grow. The collaboration with the designer turned out to be a success, bringing in new customers and boosting their brand's visibility. With each success, Sophie began to trust Ethan more, not just with the business, but with her personal life as well. She shared more about the challenges of being a single mother, about the moments when she doubted herself, and the times when she wished she had someone to lean on. Ethan listened without judgment, never pushing her to open up faster than she was ready. He didn't want to rush this process, didn't want to force her into a place where she wasn't comfortable. But with every small revelation, with every shared moment, their bond deepened. And the more time he spent with Lucas, the more he began to feel like a part of their lives. Not as a replacement for the father Lucas had never had, but as someone who cared enough to show up ease. There were still bumps along the way. There were moments when Sophie pulled back, when doubt crept in, when she questioned whether this was all really worth it. And there were times when Ethan felt the weight of his past mistakes, wondering if he could ever truly make up for the years he had lost. But they were moving forward, slowly but steadily, and that gave them both hope. The road ahead wasn't easy, but they were walking it together. Sophie's business flourished, and so did their relationship, even if it was still in its early stages. But what Ethan had learned, what they had both learned, was that love wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one that took patience, vulnerability, and the willingness to grow alongside each other. One late afternoon, as Sophie and Ethan stood outside the boutique, watching the last rays of the sun dip below the horizon, Sophie turned to him with a soft smile. There was a new warmth in her eyes, something that had been missing for so long. "I'm glad we're doing this," she said quietly. "I'm glad we're doing this together." Ethan smiled, his heart full of emotion. "Me too, Sophie. Me too." They stood there for a moment, side by side, as the world moved around them. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time, neither of them felt like they were facing it alone. They had found each other again, not in the way they had once imagined, but in a way that was real, genuine, and full of hope. And as the night fell and the lights of the boutique flickered on, they knew that whatever came next, they were ready to face it together. One step at a time. As time passes, the man learns that rebuilding trust is not an overnight process, but with patience, effort, and genuine change, anything is possible. The road to redemption isn't easy, but the real question is, can love heal the wounds of the past, or is it too late for a second chance? Only time will tell if the man can truly rebuild his family. But one thing is clear: sometimes the hardest part of moving forward is letting go of the past. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay tuned for more stories that remind us of the power of second chances, love, and redemption.